I have killed 100 children. I could have killed 500. Javed Iqbal, Lahore, 1999. The morning of December 2nd, 1999, began like any other at the Lahore police headquarters, until Officer Muhammad Aslam opened what appeared to be another routine piece of mail. The handwritten Urdu script, sprawled across cheap paper, contained words that would transform the bustling Pakistani city into the epicenter of one of history's most horrific serial killing sprees. I have killed 100 children. The letter began with chilling matter-of-factness. I could have killed 500, but my conscience told me to stop. The author signed his name with deliberate precision, Javed Iqbal. What followed was not merely a confession, but a detailed roadmap to evil. Complete addresses where bodies could be found, descriptions of methods used, and an almost academic accounting of each victim's final moments. The letter writer seemed to take perverse pride in his organizational skills, maintaining meticulous records as if documenting a business transaction rather than the systematic murder of Pakistan's most vulnerable children. In the narrow maze-like streets of Lahore's old quarter, where poverty pressed against the ancient walls like suffocating heat, street children had been disappearing for months. These were not the sons of the wealthy or the middle class. These were the invisible ones, the orphans and runaways who survived by begging, stealing, and selling their bodies to men who moved through the shadows after dark. Their disappearances barely registered with authorities accustomed to the ebb and flow of transient youth who drifted in and out of the city like ghosts. But someone had been counting. Javed Iqbal was born in 1956 into a middle-class family in Lahore, the cultural heart of Pakistan's Punjab province. His father worked as a government clerk, maintaining the kind of modest respectability that defined Pakistan's emerging middle class in the decades following independence. The family lived in a traditional haveli in the old city, its high walls and inner courtyards reflecting the Islamic architectural heritage that gave Lahore its distinctive character. From the outside, the Iqbal household appeared unremarkable, neither wealthy nor poor, neither particularly religious nor secular, simply ordinary in the way that most families aspire to be. Yet, even in childhood, there were signs that something fundamental was wrong with Javed. Teachers at his local school noted his strange detachment from other children, his tendency to watch rather than participate, and an unsettling intensity in his dark eyes when he thought no one was looking. His academic performance was mediocre at best, but it was his behavior toward younger students that first raised concerns. Several incidents involving inappropriate touching were quietly handled by school administrators who preferred to avoid scandal rather than confront the implications of a child who seemed to derive pleasure from the fear and confusion of others. As Pakistan navigated the tumultuous political landscape of the 1960s and 1970s, military coups, wars with India, and the eventual creation of Bangladesh, Javed Iqbal's personal darkness deepened. His adolescence coincided with the rule of General Zia-ul-Haq, whose Islamization policies transformed Pakistani society in profound and lasting ways. The social conservatism that characterized this period created an environment where discussions of sexuality, particularly anything considered deviant, were driven further underground. This cultural shift would later provide perfect cover for predators like Iqbal, who learned early that society's unwillingness to acknowledge uncomfortable truths could be exploited. By his early 20s, Iqbal had established a pattern that would define the rest of his life. He moved frequently between different areas of Lahore, never staying in one place long enough for neighbors to become familiar with his habits. He worked sporadically at various jobs, sometimes as a laborer, occasionally helping in small shops, but never seemed to maintain steady employment. Instead, he appeared to have access to modest amounts of money that allowed him to rent small apartments or rooms in the city's poorer neighborhoods. It was during this period that Iqbal began his systematic targeting of street children. Lahore, like most major Pakistani cities, had thousands of homeless youth living on its streets. These children, known locally as street boys, survived through a combination of begging, petty theft, and prostitution. Most had either run away from abusive homes or had been orphaned and aged out of overcrowded state institutions. Pakistani society, despite its strong emphasis on family and children, had developed a blind spot when it came to these particular young people. They existed in a legal and social grey area, not quite citizens, not quite criminals, but certainly not children deserving of protection. The first documented case connected to Iqbal occurred in early 1990, though investigators would later determine that he had likely been killing for several years before this. 13-year-old Ahmed Hassan had been living on the streets near Lahore's railway station, earning money by carrying bags for travellers and running small errands. Hassan was known to local shopkeepers as a polite, hard-working boy who sent most of his meagre earnings to his widowed mother in a village outside the city. On March 15, 1990, Hassan was seen talking to a well-dressed man near the station. Witnesses later described the stranger as middle-aged, clean-shaven, and wearing Western-style clothing that marked him as educated and relatively prosperous. The man appeared to be offering Hassan some kind of work opportunity, speaking to him quietly and showing him what looked like money. Hassan, like most street children, was always alert to chances for legitimate employment that might lift him out of poverty and vulnerability. Hassan was never seen alive again. His body was discovered 3 days later in a drainage canal on the city's outskirts. The post-mortem examination revealed a horrific pattern of abuse that would become Iqbal's signature. Evidence of sexual assault, strangulation, and deliberate mutilation, performed while the victim was still alive. Most disturbingly, the forensic pathologist noted that the injuries appeared to have been inflicted over an extended period, suggesting that Hassan had been held captive and tortured before his eventual murder. The investigation into Hassan's death was perfunctory at best. Pakistani police in the 1990s were overwhelmed by political violence, sectarian conflicts, and the general crime that plagued urban areas. The murder of a street child, while tragic, was not considered a priority when resources were stretched thin, dealing with bombings, kidnappings, and armed robberies that affected the middle and upper classes. Hassan's case file was assigned to a junior detective who conducted a few interviews with other street children before the investigation stalled and was eventually shelved. This police indifference would prove to be Iqbal's greatest advantage. Over the next 8 years, he refined his methods and expanded his hunting ground throughout Lahore and surrounding areas. His approach was methodical and calculated, designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of both his victims and the system that should have protected them. Iqbal typically targeted boys between the ages of 8 and 16, though his preferred victims were in the 12 to 14 age range. He looked for children who had been on the streets long enough to lose their initial wariness, but who still retained enough innocence to be manipulated. His hunting grounds included railway stations, bus terminals, markets, and the areas around schools where children from poor families might be found working instead of attending classes. His initial approach was always the same. He would identify a potential victim and observe them for several days, learning their routines, understanding their circumstances, and identifying their particular vulnerabilities. Some children were hungry and could be lured with promises of food and shelter. Others were seeking legitimate work and could be attracted by offers of employment. Still others were simply lonely and responded to adult attention and kindness. Iqbal was a skilled manipulator who understood the psychology of abandoned children. He presented himself as a benevolent father figure, someone who recognized their worth and wanted to help them build better lives. He was patient, sometimes spending weeks gaining a child's trust before making his move. To the outside world, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a successful businessman with a soft heart for disadvantaged youth. The children who disappeared with Iqbal were taken to a series of rented accommodations that he maintained throughout Lahore. These apartments, typically located in crowded neighborhoods where screams might be masked by the general noise of urban life, were carefully prepared for his purposes. Windows were often boarded up or covered with heavy curtains, ostensibly for privacy, but actually to muffle sound and prevent escape. The rooms were sparsely furnished but contained restraints, tools, and other equipment that spoke to Iqbal's increasingly sophisticated methods of torture and control. Once a child was in his custody, Iqbal's mask of benevolence dropped completely. What followed was a systematic program of physical and sexual abuse designed not merely to satisfy his perverse desires, but to completely break his victims' spirits. He documented much of this abuse with photographs and written records, creating a horrific archive that served both as trophies and as blackmail material should any victim somehow escape and attempt to report him. The duration of captivity varied depending on Iqbal's mood and circumstances, but most victims were held for between 2 weeks and 2 months before being murdered. During this time, they were subjected to repeated sexual assault, torture, and psychological manipulation. Iqbal seemed to derive particular pleasure from convincing his victims that their suffering was deserved, that they were worthless and unwanted by society. He would tell them that no one was looking for them, that no one cared whether they lived or died. This psychological torture was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. Many of the children Iqbal captured had already been damaged by lives of poverty, abandonment, and abuse. His systematic destruction of their remaining hope and self-worth represented a level of cruelty that went beyond mere sexual sadism into something approaching pure evil. When Iqbal finally tired of a particular victim, the murder itself was carried out with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all his actions. He typically used strangulation, sometimes with rope or wire, sometimes with his bare hands. But death was not the end of his interaction with the victims. Post-mortem examination of recovered bodies revealed that Iqbal continued to abuse and mutilate corpses, behavior that suggested his psychological pathology was continuing to evolve and deepen. The disposal of bodies presented logistical challenges that Iqbal addressed with characteristic planning and precision. Sometimes he would dismember corpses and dispose of the parts in different locations throughout the city. Other times he would dissolve remains in acid, a technique that he appeared to have researched carefully and implemented with scientific rigor. Some bodies were buried in remote locations outside Lahore, while others were simply dumped in the city's many canals and waterways. This variety in disposal methods served multiple purposes. It made it difficult for police to connect different murders to a single perpetrator, especially given the general unwillingness of authorities to invest significant resources in investigating crimes against street children. It also reflected Iqbal's growing confidence and his apparent enjoyment of the technical challenges involved in making human beings disappear without a trace. Throughout this period, there were occasional signs that might have alerted authorities to the systematic nature of these disappearances. Social workers who interacted regularly with street children began to notice that certain boys they had known for months or years were simply vanishing. Unlike the normal transient patterns of street life, these disappearances seemed more permanent and complete. Children who had established territories, relationships, and routines were simply gone without explanation or farewell. Some of the older street children began to share stories about the well-dressed man who had been seen talking to boys who later disappeared. These accounts were remarkably consistent in their descriptions of Iqbal's appearance and behavior, but they were dismissed by police as unreliable testimony from witnesses whose credibility was automatically questioned due to their social status. Several times, Iqbal came close to being caught or exposed. On at least 3 occasions, potential victims managed to escape from his custody and attempted to report their experiences to authorities. However, These children faced multiple obstacles in being believed and taken seriously. Their status as street children meant that their credibility was immediately questioned. The nature of the abuse they described was so extreme that some police officers dismissed their accounts as exaggerated or fabricated. And even when officers were inclined to investigate, the children often could not provide specific addresses or identifying information that would allow for immediate action. More damaging to potential investigations was the fact that Iqbal had chosen his hunting ground and victims with careful attention to social dynamics. Street children existed largely outside the formal structures of Pakistani society. They were not enrolled in schools, not registered with government agencies, and often had no families who would report them missing. When they disappeared, there was no system in place to notice or investigate their absence. This institutional indifference extended beyond law enforcement to the broader social infrastructure. NGOs and religious organizations that worked with street children were chronically underfunded and understaffed. Social workers who might have noticed patterns of disappearance were overwhelmed by caseloads that made detailed tracking impossible. The media, focused on political developments and middle-class concerns, paid little attention to crimes that affected only society's most marginalized members. As the 1990s progressed, Iqbal's confidence grew along with his body count. He began to take greater risks, sometimes approaching children in more public settings, or maintaining longer-term relationships with potential victims before making his move. He also began to expand his geographic range, traveling to other cities in Punjab, and even making trips to Karachi to hunt for victims in Pakistan's largest urban centre. This expansion reflected not just growing confidence, but also a recognition that his activities in Lahore were beginning to attract attention from some quarters. While police investigations remained superficial, there was growing awareness among street children themselves that something predatory was stalking their community. Word-of-mouth networks that were typically used to share information about safe places to sleep or sympathetic shopkeepers began to carry warnings about the well-dressed man who offered too-good-to-be-true opportunities to desperate children. Some of the older street children, those who had survived by developing acute instincts for danger, began to actively warn younger boys about accepting help from strangers. These informal protection networks were probably responsible for preventing additional murders, though their effectiveness was limited by the constant influx of new children to the streets and the generally chaotic nature of street life. By 1998, Iqbal had refined his methods to the point where he was operating with almost industrial efficiency. He maintained multiple safe houses, had developed reliable methods for body disposal, and had created systems for identifying and approaching potential victims. His personal records from this period, later recovered by police, reveal a mind that had fully embraced the mechanics of serial murder as a lifestyle rather than an occasional compulsion. These records also reveal the evolution of his psychological state. Early entries suggest someone struggling with guilt and attempting to justify his actions through various rationalizations. He wrote about saving children from lives of poverty and prostitution, about providing them with love that society had denied them, and about his role as someone who understood their true worth. These self-justifications became increasingly elaborate and detached from reality as his killing spree continued. Later entries show a complete abandonment of any pretense of altruism or justification. Iqbal wrote with clinical detachment about his methods, his victims' responses, and his own emotional reactions to their suffering. He began to view his activities as a form of research or artistic expression, something that elevated him above ordinary people who lacked the courage or intelligence to explore the depths of human experience. This psychological evolution was accompanied by changes in his methods and victim selection. Where early murders showed signs of impulsive violence and emotional involvement, later killings were characterized by calm, systematic torture that seemed designed more for intellectual satisfaction than emotional release, Iqbal was becoming something beyond a conventional serial killer. He was evolving into someone who viewed murder as a legitimate form of self-expression and human experimentation. The end of Iqbal's killing spree came not through effective police work or investigative breakthrough, but through his own psychological need for recognition and acknowledgement. By late 1999, he had killed at least 100 boys and possibly many more, but his crimes remained largely invisible to Pakistani society, known only to his victims and a scattered community of street children whose warnings went unheeded by authorities. For someone whose grandiose self-image had grown along with his body count, this invisibility became increasingly frustrating. Iqbal had committed what he viewed as the perfect crimes, methodical, extensive, and undetected, but perfection without recognition felt hollow to someone whose psychological makeup demanded acknowledgement of his superior intelligence and capabilities. The confession letter that arrived at Lahore Police Headquarters on December 2nd, 1999, was therefore not just an admission of guilt, but a manifesto designed to ensure that Iqbal's crimes would be recognized for their scope and sophistication. The letter provided specific details about murder methods, body disposal locations, and victim identities that could only have come from the killer himself. It was written in a tone that suggested pride rather than remorse, accomplishment rather than confession. "I am Javed Iqbal, killer of 100 children," the letter began. "I hate this world. I am not ashamed of my action, and I am ready to die. I have no regrets. I killed 100 children before deciding to kill myself. But first, I want to let you know about my 100 victims." What followed was a detailed accounting that read like a business report, rather than a murder confession. Iqbal provided names where he knew them, physical descriptions, approximate dates of death, and locations where remains could be found. He described his methods with technical precision, explaining how he had strangled his victims, how he had disposed of their bodies in acid baths, and how he had maintained detailed records of each killing. The letter also contained elements of taunting directed at police incompetence. Iqbal noted that he had been operating for nearly a decade without detection, that he had perfected methods for making human beings disappear completely, and that the authorities' failure to notice or investigate the disappearances of 100 children demonstrated their fundamental inadequacy. Most chillingly, the letter suggested that the 100 murders were simply the ones he was willing to admit to. "I could have killed 500, he wrote, "but my conscience told me to stop." This hint that his actual victim count might be significantly higher was consistent with investigators' later findings that similar disappearances had been occurring throughout the 1990s across multiple Pakistani cities. The police response to Iqbal's confession letter was initially one of skepticism mixed with horror. The systematic murder of 100 children seemed almost impossible to believe, especially given that such a crime spree had apparently occurred without official notice or investigation. However, the specific details provided in the letter, addresses, names, physical descriptions, were too accurate to dismiss as the fantasies of a mentally disturbed individual seeking attention. Detective Inspector Sarfraz Ahmed was assigned to lead the investigation into Iqbal's claims. Ahmed was a 20-year veteran of Lahore police who had worked on numerous murder cases, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the systematic nature of what he was about to uncover. His first step was to visit the addresses provided in the confession letter to determine whether physical evidence could corroborate Iqbal's claims. The first location was a small apartment in Lahore's Shadowy district, a crowded neighborhood where families lived in close proximity and privacy was a luxury few could afford. The apartment had been rented under a false name and had been vacant for several months when police arrived with a search warrant. Initial examination revealed nothing obviously suspicious, just an empty space with boarded windows and minimal furniture. However, More detailed forensic examination told a different story. Luminol testing revealed extensive blood spatter patterns on walls and floors that had been carefully cleaned but not completely eliminated. Chemical analysis of stains in the bathroom revealed traces of acids consistent with body disposal methods described in Iqbal's letter. Most damning was the discovery of small personal items, pieces of clothing, cheap jewellery, children's toys that had apparently been overlooked during cleanup efforts. Similar evidence was found at 4 additional locations provided in the confession letter. Each apartment or room bore the same signature: boarded windows, minimal furniture, evidence of careful cleanup, and traces of chemicals used for body disposal. The consistency of these findings across multiple locations suggested a level of planning and organisation that supported Iqbal's claims about the systematic nature of his crimes. While forensic teams processed these crime scenes, other investigators began the grim task of attempting to identify Iqbal's victims. This proved to be extraordinarily difficult, given that most were street children whose disappearances had never been formally reported. Police began interviewing social workers, NGO personnel, and older street children who might have information about boys who had vanished over the previous decade. These interviews revealed the true scope of the tragedy. Dozens of social workers and street children provided names and descriptions of boys who had simply disappeared without explanation over the years. The accounts were remarkably consistent in describing a pattern of disappearances that targeted the most vulnerable children, the newest arrivals to street life, the youngest boys, those who had been most damaged by previous abuse and were therefore most susceptible to manipulation. Many of these potential victims were identified only by nicknames or physical descriptions, making definitive identification impossible. However, investigators were able to compile a list of more than 150 children who had disappeared under circumstances consistent with Iqbal's methods during the time frame of his killing spree. This number suggested that his confession to 100 murders might actually be conservative. The search for Javed Iqbal himself proved to be more challenging than documenting his crimes. The return address on his confession letter was false, and none of the apartments he had used for his murders had been rented under his real name. He appeared to have systematically erased his presence from official records, maintaining no permanent address, no regular employment, and no traceable financial accounts. However, investigators eventually developed leads through the network of small businesses and informal services that comprised much of Lahore's economy. Several shopkeepers recalled a man matching Iqbal's description who had been a regular customer over the years, always paying in cash and never providing personal information. A taxi driver remembered making multiple trips for the same passenger, taking him between different neighborhoods with bags that were surprisingly heavy for their size. These fragmentary accounts helped investigators piece together Iqbal's movements and methods, but they did not lead to his immediate capture. He had apparently anticipated the eventual discovery of his crimes and had prepared accordingly. His confession letter had been mailed from a location hundreds of miles from Lahore, and subsequent investigation suggested that he had been travelling throughout Pakistan in the weeks following its dispatch. The manhunt for Iqbal became a national priority as news of his crimes spread throughout Pakistani media. The systematic murder of 100 children represented a crime of unprecedented scope in Pakistani history, challenging fundamental assumptions about child safety and social protection. Public outrage was intense, directed not only at Iqbal himself, but at the institutional failures that had allowed such extensive crimes to go undetected for nearly a decade. Religious leaders across Pakistan condemned the murders while also calling for broader social reforms to protect vulnerable children. The case highlighted the existence of thousands of street children living in conditions that made them easy targets for predators, leading to calls for expanded social services and institutional reforms. Political leaders promised increased funding for child protection services, while also acknowledging that such promises had been made and broken repeatedly in the past. The international media attention that followed the case was perhaps even more damaging to Pakistani authorities than domestic criticism. Foreign journalists portrayed the Iqbal case as evidence of broader social dysfunction and governmental incompetence. The fact that 100 children could be systematically murdered without official notice was presented as a symbol of Pakistan's failure to protect its most vulnerable citizens. This international scrutiny added additional pressure to capture Iqbal quickly and bring him to justice. Pakistani authorities understood that their credibility, both domestically and internationally, depended on demonstrating that such crimes would be punished, and that systems would be reformed to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The break in the case came in January 2000, nearly a month after Iqbal's confession letter had been received. Acting on a tip from an informant, police raided a small hotel in Sahawa, a town about 100 kilometers from Lahore. The raid was part of a broader sweep of locations where Iqbal might be hiding, based on intelligence suggesting that he was staying in small towns, rather than major cities. When police entered room 15 of the Sahawa Inn, they found 3 men who initially claimed to be traveling salesmen. However, one of the men matched the physical description of Javed Iqbal that had been developed through witness interviews and existing police records. When confronted with his identity, the man initially denied being Iqbal before eventually admitting his true name. The other 2 men were identified as Sajid Ahmad and Ishaq Billah, associates who had apparently assisted Iqbal in various aspects of his crimes. All 3 were arrested and transported to Lahore for interrogation and formal charging. Iqbal's arrest created a media sensation throughout Pakistan. Photographs of him being led away in handcuffs were published on front pages across the country, along with detailed accounts of his crimes and their scope. Public anger was intense, with crowds gathering outside the courthouse demanding immediate execution and protesting what they saw as the government's failure to protect children. During initial interrogations, Iqbal was largely cooperative, providing additional details about his crimes and methods that corroborated the information in his confession letter. He showed no apparent remorse for his actions, instead seeming to take pride in the scope and systematic nature of his killing spree. When asked about his motivation, he provided rambling explanations that mixed grandiose self-justification with bitter complaints about society's treatment of him. More disturbing was his attitude toward his victims. Iqbal consistently referred to the murdered children as willing participants in their own deaths, claiming that they had been grateful for the attention and care he provided. He seemed genuinely unable to understand that his actions constituted crimes, rather than misunderstood acts of compassion. This psychological detachment from reality suggested a level of mental disturbance that went beyond conventional criminality into the realm of profound personality disorder. The legal proceedings against Iqbal began in March 2000, amid unprecedented security and media attention. Pakistani authorities were determined to demonstrate that the justice system could respond effectively to crimes of such magnitude, while also ensuring that the proceedings themselves would serve as a deterrent to future offenders. The prosecution's case was built primarily around Iqbal's detailed confession, the physical evidence recovered from his various safe houses, and testimony from the few surviving witnesses who could provide information about his methods and movements. Given the nature of his victims and the systematic destruction of evidence, traditional investigative methods had limited effectiveness. However, the confession letter and Iqbal's subsequent statements to police provided more than enough evidence to support multiple murder charges. His detailed knowledge of crime scenes, disposal methods, and victim characteristics could only have come from personal involvement in the murders. The consistency between his confessions and the physical evidence found at various locations eliminated any reasonable doubt about his guilt. The defense strategy was necessarily limited given the overwhelming evidence of Iqbal's guilt. His attorneys focused on mental health issues, arguing that their client was suffering from severe psychological disorders that impaired his ability to understand the nature and consequences of his actions. They presented psychiatric testimony suggesting that Iqbal's grandiose delusions and detachment from reality indicated serious mental illness rather than calculated criminality. This psychiatric defense was complicated by Iqbal's obvious intelligence and the systematic nature of his crimes. The careful planning involved in maintaining multiple safe houses, developing victim identification methods, and creating efficient body disposal systems demonstrated a level of cognitive function that contradicted claims of severe mental impairment. The confession letter itself, with its detailed and organized presentation of information, suggested someone who understood exactly what he had done and was proud of his accomplishments. The trial proceedings were emotionally charged, with family members of identified victims providing heartbreaking testimony about their losses and the impact of not knowing what had happened to their children. Social workers and NGO personnel testified about the broader context of street children's vulnerability and the systematic failures that had enabled Iqbal's crimes to continue undetected. Perhaps most powerful was testimony from some of the older street children who had witnessed Iqbal's recruitment methods or had survived encounters with him. These young witnesses, many of whom had never spoken to authorities before, provided chilling accounts of how Iqbal had presented himself as a benefactor while actually hunting for victims among society's most vulnerable children. The prosecution also presented evidence about the broader scope of child disappearances during the period of Iqbal's known activity. While not all of these disappearances could be definitively linked to him, the pattern of vanished children strongly suggested that his actual victim count exceeded even his confession to 100 murders. On March 16, 2000, after less than 3 weeks of testimony, the court found Javed Iqbal guilty on 100 counts of murder. The verdict was accompanied by an extraordinary sentence that reflected both the magnitude of his crimes and the court's determination to send a message about the consequences of such actions. Judge Al-Baksh sentenced Iqbal to death, but specified that the execution should be carried out in the same manner that he had killed his victims, by strangulation. Furthermore, the judge ordered that Iqbal should be cut into 100 pieces after his death and dissolved in acid, just as he had done to his victims. The sentence concluded with the requirement that his body parts should be displayed publicly as a warning to others who might contemplate similar crimes. This sentence, while emotionally satisfying to many Pakistanis who were outraged by the scope of Iqbal's crimes, was controversial from a legal perspective. International human rights organizations criticized the prescribed method of execution as cruel and unusual punishment that violated international standards for capital punishment. Legal scholars noted that the sentence seemed designed more for symbolic impact than practical implementation. The sentence also reflected the broader social trauma that Iqbal's crimes had inflicted on Pakistani society. The systematic murder of 100 children challenged fundamental assumptions about child safety and social order. The fact that such extensive crimes had gone undetected for nearly a decade raised uncomfortable questions about institutional competence and social priorities. However, the implementation of this extraordinary sentence would never be tested. On October 8, 2001, while awaiting execution on death row, Javed Iqbal was found dead in his prison cell. Official reports stated that he had committed suicide by hanging himself with bed sheets, though the circumstances of his death remained controversial and were disputed by some family members and legal observers. The timing of Iqbal's death, just weeks before his scheduled execution, eliminated the legal and practical challenges that would have accompanied attempts to implement the court's unusual sentence. It also denied Pakistani society the closure that might have come from seeing justice fully carried out according to the court's specifications. More significantly, Iqbal's death ended any possibility of obtaining additional information about his crimes, his methods, or the full scope of his victims. Investigators had hoped that continued interrogation might reveal details about additional murders, the identities of more victims, or information about potential accomplices who had not been identified and charged. The case of Javed Iqbal represents more than just an individual criminal's descent into evil. It illuminates broader failures in social systems designed to protect society's most vulnerable members. The systematic murder of 100 street children was possible not just because of one man's depravity, but because of institutional indifference that allowed such children to exist outside the protection of law and social services. Pakistani authorities acknowledged these systemic failures and promised reforms, but meaningful change proved difficult to implement. Street children continued to face similar vulnerabilities in the years following Iqbal's death, and subsequent cases of child abuse and exploitation suggested that the institutional problems that enabled his crimes had not been fully addressed. The international attention focused on the case also highlighted Pakistan's broader struggles with child protection and social services. International observers noted that while Iqbal's crimes were exceptional in their scope, the underlying conditions that made them possible, poverty, social indifference, and institutional inadequacy, were common throughout the developing world. Perhaps most tragically, the 100 children who died during Iqbal's killing spree remained largely anonymous even after his conviction and death. Despite extensive investigation, many victims were never definitively identified, and their families never learned what had happened to them. They remain forgotten casualties of both individual evil and systematic failure, children whose lives and deaths serve as testimony to the consequences of societal indifference toward the most vulnerable. The legacy of Javed Iqbal's crimes continues to influence Pakistani discussions about child protection, social services, and criminal justice. His case remains a reference point for advocates seeking improved services for street children and better institutional responses to child abuse. It also serves as a reminder that even the most horrific crimes can occur when society chooses to look away from uncomfortable truths about the treatment of its most vulnerable members. In the end, the story of Javed Iqbal is not just about one man's capacity for evil, but about the social conditions that enabled that evil to flourish unchecked for nearly a decade. It stands as a testament to the importance of vigilance, institutional competence, and social responsibility in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Most importantly, it serves as a memorial to 100 children whose brief lives ended in unimaginable terror, and whose deaths demand that society do better in safeguarding the vulnerable and the voiceless. The Landlady's Garden. The morning fog clung to Sacramento's F Street like a shroud on November 11th, 1988, when Detective John Cabrera first caught the scent that would haunt him for decades. It wasn't the usual urban cocktail of exhaust fumes and yesterday's garbage that hung in the air around 1426 F Street. This was something else entirely, something organic and wrong that seemed to seep from the very earth beneath the Victorian boarding house's carefully tended garden. Dorothea Helen Gray had spent 73 years perfecting the art of appearing harmless. Standing barely 5 feet tall in her sensible shoes, with silver hair pulled back in a modest bun and reading glasses perched on her nose, she embodied every cultural archetype of the nurturing grandmother. Her neighbours knew her as the kind woman who ran the boarding house for society's forgotten, elderly men and women subsisting on social security checks, many battling mental illness or addiction, all desperately seeking a place to belong in a world that had moved past them. What they didn't know was that Dorothea Puente had been practicing deception since childhood, honing skills that would eventually make her one of America's most prolific serial killers, and the architect of a social services fraud scheme that netted millions of dollars over nearly a decade. Born Dorothea Helen Gray on January 9th, 1929, in Redlands, California, she entered a world already fractured by abandonment and violence. Her father, Jesse James Gray, was a cotton picker whose own violent tendencies would later be reflected in his daughter's crimes. When Dorothea was 6 years old, her mother died, leaving her and her siblings to navigate a childhood marked by foster homes, relatives who didn't want them, and the kind of institutional neglect that would later inform her understanding of how society's vulnerable could simply disappear without anyone noticing. The pattern of deception began early. Court records from Riverside County show that by age 16, Dorothea had already mastered the art of identity manipulation, forging documents to marry a much older man named Fred McFall in 1945. The marriage lasted only months, but it established a template she would follow for the rest of her life. Identify vulnerable targets, exploit their resources, and disappear when the situation became untenable. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Dorothea moved through California like a ghost, leaving behind a trail of fraudulent checks, stolen identities, and broken lives. She married Roberto José Puente in 1952, a union that gave her the surname she would carry into infamy, but the relationship followed the same destructive pattern. Police reports from this period paint a picture of a woman already perfecting her craft. She would target elderly men, often immigrants with limited English, gain their trust through romantic relationships, and systematically drain their bank accounts before vanishing. The psychological profile that would later emerge during her trial revealed a woman with profound antisocial personality disorder, but also someone with an almost supernatural ability to read people's vulnerabilities and exploit them. Dr. John Stahlberg, the forensic psychiatrist who examined Puente extensively, noted that she displayed an unusual combination of superficial charm and complete emotional detachment. She could mimic empathy so convincingly that even experienced social workers were fooled. By the early 1960s, Puente had discovered something that would define the rest of her criminal career. America's social safety net was riddled with gaps that a clever operator could exploit. The Social Security system, expanded under Roosevelt's New Deal, created a bureaucratic maze that was difficult to navigate and even more difficult to monitor effectively. Elderly, disabled, and mentally ill individuals often fell through these cracks, becoming invisible to the very system designed to protect them. Puente's first documented foray into systematic fraud began in 1968, when she opened a boarding house on F Street in Sacramento. The location was strategically chosen, close enough to downtown social services offices that her residents could easily access benefits, but in a transitional neighborhood where unusual activity wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Sacramento in the late 1960s was experiencing rapid growth, and the downtown area was filled with similar boarding houses catering to society's marginal populations. The setup was ingenious in its simplicity. Puente would target elderly individuals receiving Social Security or disability benefits, offering them a clean room, regular meals, and medication management in exchange for signing over their government checks. Many of her early residents were genuinely grateful for the arrangement. Puente maintained a clean, well-organized house, served nutritious meals, and displayed the kind of maternal attention that many of her residents had been lacking for years. But beneath this veneer of care lurked something far more sinister. Probate records from Sacramento County reveal that Puente had begun forging power of attorney documents as early as 1970, giving herself legal authority over her residents' financial affairs. She would then systematically drain their bank accounts, liquidate their assets, and in some cases, continue collecting their government benefits long after they had died. The first confirmed murder occurred in 1982, though investigators later suspected that Puente's killing spree may have begun several years earlier. Everson Gilmouth, a 77-year-old retiree, had met Puente through a Lonely Hearts advertisement. After a brief courtship, Gilmouth moved into the F Street boarding house, bringing with him his Social Security benefits and a modest savings account. According to court testimony, Puente began systematically poisoning Gilmouth with a combination of codeine and Tylenol, a method she had likely perfected through trial and error on previous victims. The beauty of this approach was its subtlety. Elderly residents dying from apparent medical complications raised no suspicions in a population already considered high risk. Gilmouth's death in November 1985 established the pattern that would define Puente's killing spree over the next 3 years. She would continue collecting the victims' social security benefits by forging their signatures on checks, telling neighbors and social workers that the resident had moved to live with relatives or had been hospitalized. The Social Security Administration's bureaucratic inefficiency meant that these fraudulent claims could continue for months or even years before being detected. The psychological dynamics within Puente's boarding house created the perfect environment for her crimes to flourish. Most of her residents were profoundly isolated, with limited family connections and few friends who might notice their absence. Many struggled with mental illness or substance abuse, conditions that made them less credible witnesses if they did report suspicious activity. Puente exploited these vulnerabilities ruthlessly, creating an atmosphere where residents were grateful for her attention, while remaining completely unaware of the danger they faced. Dorothy Miller, a 64-year-old woman with developmental disabilities, became Puente's second confirmed victim in January 1987. Miller had been referred to the boarding house by Sacramento County Social Services, which maintained a list of approved facilities for clients who needed supervised living arrangements. The county's social workers conducted periodic welfare checks, but these visits were scheduled in advance and easily manipulated by someone with Puente's experience in deception. Court records show that Miller's death followed the same pattern as Gilmouth's: gradual poisoning with prescription medications, followed by burial in Puente's backyard garden and continued collection of benefits. Puente had convinced Miller to sign a power of attorney document shortly after moving in, giving her complete control over the woman's finances. The backyard of 1426 F Street became Puente's primary burial ground, though investigators would later discover that she had also disposed of bodies in other locations throughout Sacramento. The garden itself was a masterpiece of misdirection. Puente maintained beautiful flower beds and vegetable plots that served as perfect cover for her gruesome activities. Neighbors frequently complimented her on the lush vegetation, never suspecting that the extraordinary fertility of her soil came from human remains. Benjamin Fink, a 55-year-old alcoholic veteran, died in April 1987 after living in Puente's boarding house for only 6 weeks. Fink's military pension and disability benefits made him an attractive target, but his death also highlighted how easily vulnerable individuals could disappear within America's social services system. Veterans Administration records show that benefit checks continued to be deposited into Fink's account for 8 months after his death, with Puente forging his signature to withdraw the funds. The psychological profile that emerged during Puente's trial revealed someone who viewed her victims not as human beings, but as financial instruments to be exploited. Dr. Stahlberg noted that Puente displayed complete emotional detachment from the suffering she caused. She spoke about her victims' deaths with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss the weather. Leona Carpenter, a 78-year-old widow, became another victim in August 1987. Carpenter had been referred to Puente's boarding house after a series of hospitalizations left her unable to live independently. Social services records indicate that Carpenter was initially pleased with the arrangement, writing to her sister that she had found a nice lady who takes good care of me. The letter would be Carpenter's last communication with her family. Within weeks of arriving at F Street, she was dead, poisoned with the same combination of medications that had killed the others. Puente buried her body in the backyard garden beneath a patch of prize-winning roses that became the subject of neighborhood admiration. The scale of Puente's fraud operation was staggering. Financial records compiled during the investigation revealed that she had stolen over $4 million in government benefits between 1982 and 1988. Money that should have supported some of society's most vulnerable individuals. She used these funds to maintain an elaborate lifestyle, purchasing expensive jewelry, taking luxury vacations, and maintaining multiple bank accounts under various aliases. Betty Palmer, a 78-year-old former teacher, arrived at the boarding house in September 1987, drawn by Puente's reputation for providing excellent care to elderly residents. Palmer had taught elementary school for 40 years before retiring, and her pension provided a steady income that made her an attractive target. Within a month of her arrival, Palmer was dead, though her death certificate listed natural causes, a testament to Puente's skill at avoiding suspicion. The investigation would later reveal that Puente had developed relationships with several local doctors who were willing to sign death certificates without conducting thorough examinations. Dr. Jerome Lackner, who signed certificates for several of Puente's victims, later testified that he had trusted Puente's descriptions of her residents' medical conditions and had no reason to suspect foul play. James Gallup, a 62-year-old man with schizophrenia, became another victim in October 1987. Gallup's disability benefits and his vulnerability due to mental illness made him an ideal target for Puente's predatory scheme. His death highlighted the particular danger faced by individuals with mental health conditions, who were often dismissed by authorities if they tried to report suspicious activity. The turning point in Puente's killing spree came with the murder of Alvaro Bert Montoya in November 1988. Unlike her previous victims, Montoya had a social worker, Judy Moyse, who maintained regular contact with him and genuinely cared about his welfare. When Moyse was unable to reach Montoya for several days, she became suspicious and contacted police. Detective John Cabrera's initial visit to 1426 F Street on November 11, 1988, was intended as a routine welfare check. Puente met him at the door with her characteristic grandmotherly demeanor, explaining that Montoya had gone to visit relatives in Los Angeles. She invited Cabrera into her immaculately maintained boarding house, offering him coffee and discussing her work caring for society's forgotten individuals. But Cabrera noticed something that would prove crucial to breaking the case: a faint but persistent odor that seemed to emanate from the backyard garden. When he mentioned it to Puente, she quickly explained that she had been using fertilizer and that the smell would dissipate soon. The explanation seemed reasonable, but something about Puente's nervous energy made Cabrera suspicious. The following day, Cabrera returned with a search warrant and a team of investigators. What they discovered in Puente's garden would shock even experienced homicide detectives. The first body was found just 18 inches below the surface, wrapped in plastic and buried beneath a patch of vegetables. The remains were in various states of decomposition, but the pattern was immediately clear. This was a burial ground, not a crime of passion. Over the next several days, investigators would uncover 7 bodies in Puente's backyard, each showing signs of systematic poisoning. The forensic evidence painted a picture of calculated murder carried out over several years by someone who had perfected the art of killing while maintaining a facade of compassionate caregiving. The toxicology reports revealed that Puente's preferred method of murder was a combination of codeine and acetaminophen, administered in gradually increasing doses that would mimic the effects of natural illness in elderly victims. Dr. Gary Walter, the forensic pathologist who examined the remains, noted that this method required considerable medical knowledge and suggested that Puente had likely experimented with different drug combinations to perfect her technique. When police arrived to arrest Puente on November 17, 1988, they found that she had disappeared. A massive manhunt ensued, involving federal authorities due to the Social Security fraud charges. The search would last 4 days and span multiple states before Puente was finally apprehended at a Los Angeles hotel, where she had been calmly reading newspapers and watching television reports about her crimes. The arrest of Dorothea Puente sent shockwaves through Sacramento's social services community, forcing officials to confront the systematic failures that had allowed her to operate undetected for so long. The case revealed glaring weaknesses in the oversight of board and care facilities, inadequate background checks for operators, and a bureaucratic culture that prioritized efficiency over client safety. During her trial, which began in 1993, prosecutors painted a picture of a woman who had turned caring for the elderly into a murder-for-profit enterprise. The evidence included detailed financial records showing how Puente had stolen millions of dollars in government benefits, testimony from survivors who described the atmosphere of fear within the boarding house, and forensic evidence that proved systematic poisoning. The defense team, led by attorney Kevin Climo, attempted to portray Puente as a woman who had genuinely cared for her residents and whose only crime was continuing to collect their benefits after they died of natural causes. This strategy proved ineffective against the overwhelming forensic evidence and the testimony of survivors who described Puente's controlling behavior and their fear of speaking out against her. The psychological evaluation conducted during the trial revealed the full extent of Puente's antisocial personality disorder. Dr. Stahlberg testified that Puente showed complete lack of empathy for her victims and an inability to comprehend the moral implications of her actions. He noted that she viewed her crimes purely in terms of risk and reward, with no consideration for the human suffering she had caused. The trial also revealed the broader social context that had enabled Puente's crimes. Testimony from social workers, family members, and community advocates highlighted how society's most vulnerable individuals could disappear without anyone noticing, falling through gaps in bureaucratic systems that were supposed to protect them. On August 26, 1993, after deliberating for more than a month, the jury found Dorothea Puente guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution had been unable to prove premeditation in all 9 suspected cases, due to the advanced decomposition of some remains. But the evidence for the 3 convictions was overwhelming. During the penalty phase of the trial, the same jury that had convicted Puente was tasked with deciding whether she should receive the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole. The decision would ultimately hinge on whether the aggravating factors, the calculated nature of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and the financial motivation outweighed any mitigating circumstances. The penalty phase testimony included heart-wrenching victim impact statements from family members who described not only their grief over losing loved ones, but their horror at discovering how their relatives had spent their final months in fear and confusion. These statements provided a human dimension to crimes that might otherwise have been viewed as merely financial in nature. On August 27, 1993, the jury sentenced Dorothea Puente to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The decision reflected their recognition that while Puente's crimes were heinous, her age and the absence of prior violent convictions created some doubt about whether the death penalty was appropriate. The case of Dorothea Puente exposed systematic failures in America's social safety net that continue to resonate today. Her ability to operate undetected for nearly a decade highlighted the vulnerability of elderly and disabled individuals within institutional care systems, and the ease with which government benefits could be fraudulently obtained and maintained. The investigation also revealed the particular dangers faced by society's most marginal populations. Individuals whose deaths might not be noticed or investigated because they lacked strong family connections or community ties. Puente had specifically targeted these vulnerable populations, understanding that their disappearances would likely go unnoticed. Following Puente's conviction, California implemented significant reforms to its board and care licensing system, including mandatory background checks for operators, more frequent unannounced inspections, and better coordination between social services agencies and law enforcement. These changes came too late for Puente's victims, but they potentially prevented future tragedies. The financial investigation revealed the staggering scope of Puente's fraud operation. Federal prosecutors estimated that she had stolen over $4 million in Social Security and disability benefits, money that represented the life savings and survival resources of dozens of vulnerable individuals. The investigation led to reforms in how the Social Security Administration monitors benefit payments and investigates suspicious activity. Dorothea Puente died in prison on March 27, 2011, at the age of 82, having served 18 years of her life sentence. She had continued to maintain her innocence until the end, claiming that her residents had died of natural causes and that she had only continued collecting their benefits out of necessity. The legacy of her crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case became a touchstone for discussions about elder abuse, institutional neglect, and the vulnerability of society's most marginal populations. It highlighted how predators could exploit both individual vulnerabilities and systematic weaknesses to commit crimes on a massive scale. The victims of Dorothea Puente were more than statistics in a fraud investigation. They were individuals who had lived full lives, contributed to their communities, and deserved dignity and respect in their final years. Instead, they found themselves in the hands of a woman who viewed them as nothing more than sources of income, to be exploited and discarded when they were no longer useful. The garden at 1426 F Street, once the scene of such horror, was eventually demolished along with the boarding house. The lot remains empty today, a stark reminder of the crimes that took place there and the lives that were lost. But the memory of Dorothea Puente's victims lives on in the reforms that followed their deaths and in the ongoing efforts to protect society's most vulnerable individuals from those who would exploit them. The case serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear the most benign disguises, and that society's most vulnerable populations require not just services and support, but vigilant protection from those who would prey upon their weakness. In a world where the elderly and disabled often feel invisible, the crimes of Dorothea Puente stand as a stark warning about what can happen when society fails to watch over those who cannot protect themselves. Puente spent her final 2 decades at the California Institution for Women in Chowchilla, where she remained until her natural cause death. The Video Killer, inside Maury Travis's House of Horrors. The first thing Detective Ray Carlisle noticed when he stepped into the basement at 1001 Ford Drive wasn't the smell, though that would hit him moments later like a physical blow. It wasn't even the bizarre contraptions scattered across the concrete floor, their purpose unclear but undeniably sinister. What struck him first, on that sweltering June afternoon in 2002, was the television. It sat there in the corner, ordinary and suburban, the kind you'd find in any American family room. Except this wasn't any American family room. This was a chamber of horrors that would soon earn comparison to the most depraved crime scenes in modern history. And that television had been the window through which Maury Troy Travis had watched his victims die. The tip had come in through MapQuest, of all places. In what would later be hailed as a pioneering moment in digital forensics, investigators had traced an anonymous letter sent to the Saint, Louis Post-Dispatch, back to a computer user who had printed directions to one of the body dump sites. The letter, mailed on May 21, 2002, contained a hand-drawn map marking the locations where more bodies could be found, along with a taunting message. "I'll tell you where many others are." The sender had signed it simply, Map Guy. But Maury Travis had made a fatal error in his technological hubris. When he printed those MapQuest directions to West Alton, he had unknowingly embedded metadata that would lead FBI cybercrime specialists directly to his doorstep. The same technological sophistication that had allowed him to videotape his crimes in stunning, horrifying detail had ultimately betrayed him. Travis had grown up in Ferguson, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis, that would later gain international notoriety for different reasons entirely. Born on October 25, 1965, to Sandra and Michael V. Travis, he was raised in what neighbors described as a stable, working-class household. His mother worked as a nurse, his father in construction. By all outward appearances, the Travis family embodied middle American respectability. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, something had gone terribly wrong. Travis's childhood, while not marked by the extreme abuse that characterized many serial killers' backgrounds, showed subtle signs of the darkness that would later consume him. He was reportedly a loner, preferring the company of computers and electronics to that of other children. Teachers remembered him as intelligent but withdrawn, the kind of student who faded into the background unless specifically called upon. His fascination with technology manifested early. While other teenagers in the 1980s were discovering music and dating, Travis was building computers and experimenting with early forms of digital surveillance. He would later tell a cellmate that he had begun fantasizing about capturing and controlling women while still in high school, though these claims would never be verified. By the time he reached adulthood, Travis had developed what psychologists would later identify as a sophisticated understanding of predatory behavior, combined with an almost savant-like grasp of technology. He worked various jobs: restaurant server, hotel clerk, computer technician, but none seemed to hold his interest for long. What did hold his interest, investigators would discover, was an increasingly elaborate fantasy life centered on domination and torture. The first victim authorities could definitively connect to Travis was Alicia Greenwade, though by the time they made this connection, she had been dead for nearly 2 years. Greenwade, 34, had been working as a prostitute in East Street. Lewis when she disappeared in April 2000. Her body was discovered on April 1st, 2001, in West Alton, Missouri, bearing signs of strangulation and sexual assault. At the time, her death was investigated as an isolated incident. The area where she was found, a desolate stretch of land near the Mississippi River, was known as a dumping ground for bodies, a place where the urban decay of St. Louis seemed to bleed into the Missouri countryside. Homicide detectives processed the scene methodically, collecting evidence and conducting interviews. But without a clear suspect or obvious connections to other crimes, the case gradually went cold. What investigators didn't know was that Alicia Greenwade's final hours had been meticulously documented. In the basement of 1001 Ford Drive, Travis had been building what he called his playhouse, a torture chamber equipped with multiple video cameras, restraining devices, and an array of instruments designed to inflict maximum suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible. The house itself was unremarkable, a modest ranch-style home in Ferguson that Travis had inherited from his grandmother. From the street, it looked like thousands of other homes in suburban St. Louis. Well-maintained lawn, tidy exterior, the kind of place where neighbors might drop by to borrow a cup of sugar. The basement, however, had been transformed into something out of a nightmare. Travis had spent years perfecting his setup. The concrete walls had been painted white to provide better lighting for his cameras. Hooks had been drilled into the ceiling at precisely calculated intervals. A makeshift operating table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by video equipment that would have been impressive in a professional studio. He had even installed a two-way mirror, allowing him to observe his victims without being seen, but it was the videotapes that would ultimately provide the most damning evidence against him. When FBI agents finally executed their search warrant on June 7, 2002, they discovered a collection of homemade recordings that documented Travis's crimes in unprecedented detail. The tapes, numbering in the dozens, showed at least 12 different women being tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered. The victims represented a cross-section of St. Louis' most vulnerable population. Most were prostitutes or drug addicts, women whose disappearances were often barely investigated by police. Travis had clearly chosen his targets carefully, selecting victims whose absence was unlikely to trigger intensive law enforcement response. Among those identified on the tapes was Betty James, 46, whose decomposed remains had been found in West Alton in May 2002. James had been reported missing by her family 6 months earlier, but her case had received minimal attention from investigators. The tape showing her final moments revealed that she had survived in Travis's basement for several days before finally succumbing to her injuries. Another victim was Verona Thompson, 36, whose body was discovered in 2001. Thompson had been a mother of 3 who had turned to prostitution to support a drug habit. The video evidence showed that Travis had kept her alive for nearly a week, subjecting her to systematic torture while maintaining a running commentary about his intentions and methods. Perhaps most disturbing were the tapes that showed Travis interacting with his victims before their deaths. He had developed what appeared to be a ritualized pattern of behavior, beginning each session by explaining to his victims what was going to happen to them. He spoke in a calm, almost conversational tone, as if discussing the weather rather than describing plans for torture and murder. "You're never going to see your family again," he could be heard telling one victim. "Nobody is looking for you. Nobody cares about you. You belong to me now." The psychological profile that emerged from these recordings painted a picture of a killer who was both methodical and sadistic. Unlike many serial killers who act impulsively or in response to specific triggers, Travis appeared to have developed his methodology through careful planning and experimentation. He had studied the techniques of other serial killers, incorporating elements from cases ranging from Gary Heidnick's Philadelphia basement prison to the torture methods employed by Leonard Lake and Charles Ng in California. Dr. Roberta Ryder, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the case materials, would later testify that Travis represented a new breed of serial killer, one who combined traditional sadistic impulses with modern technology to create an unprecedented level of documentation and control. He wasn't just killing these women, she explained in her report. He was creating a permanent record of their suffering, something he could revisit and relive indefinitely. The investigation that led to Travis's capture had been years in the making, though investigators didn't realize it at the time. Beginning in 2000, bodies had been turning up in West Alton and surrounding areas at an alarming rate. The victims were primarily women involved in prostitution, and the pattern of injuries suggested a single perpetrator. Detective Ray Carlisle, a 20-year veteran of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, had been tracking these cases since the discovery of Alicia Greenwade's body. What initially appeared to be unrelated deaths gradually began to form a pattern. The victims were all found in similar locations, all showed signs of prolonged torture, and all had been strangled with ligatures that left distinctive marks. The breakthrough came with the letter to the Post-Dispatch. The newspaper had been covering the West Alton murders extensively, and the anonymous correspondence appeared to be from someone with intimate knowledge of the crimes. The hand-drawn map included accurate locations of body dump sites that had not been publicized, along with coordinates for additional sites where more victims could be found. FBI cybercrime specialist Jennifer Lynch was tasked with tracing the letter's origins. The key was the MapQuest printout that had been included with the correspondence. By working with Microsoft's technical support team, Lynch was able to identify the IP address that had accessed the mapping service on the date the directions were printed. The trail led to WorldCom, an internet service provider that maintained detailed logs of customer activity. From there, investigators were able to identify the specific account holder, Maury Travis, 1001 Ford Drive, Ferguson, Missouri. The arrest took place on June 7, 2002, at Travis's workplace, a restaurant called Chick-fil-A where he had been employed as a manager for the past 8 months. Co-workers described him as quiet and efficient, the kind of employee who arrived early and stayed late without complaint. They expressed shock when federal agents arrived to take him into custody. Travis himself seemed almost relieved when the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. According to FBI Special Agent John Douglas, who conducted the initial interview, Travis appeared to have been expecting this moment for some time. He didn't seem surprised, Douglas recalled. If anything, he seemed curious about how we had found him. The search of 1001 Ford Drive began immediately after the arrest. What investigators found in the basement exceeded their worst expectations. In addition to the video equipment and torture devices, they discovered photographs of victims, newspaper clippings about their disappearances, and a detailed journal in which Travis had documented his crimes. The journal entries, written in Travis's neat handwriting, provided insight into his psychological state during the murders. He wrote about his victims as if they were laboratory subjects, noting their responses to different forms of torture and rating their performance during the assault. He had even created a rating system, scoring victims on factors like endurance and fear response. One entry, dated March 15, 2001, read, "Subject number 7 lasted longer than expected." The psychological component appears to be as important as the physical. Fear amplifies pain. Note for next time: begin with psychological torture before moving to physical methods. The clinical detachment evident in these writings horrified even experienced investigators. Detective Carlyle, who had worked hundreds of homicide cases during his career, would later describe the journal as the most disturbing document I've ever read. He was treating these women like objects in an experiment, not human beings. The videotapes themselves presented a unique challenge for the investigation. While they provided irrefutable evidence of Travis's guilt, they were also too graphic to be viewed by most personnel involved in the case. A special team of FBI analysts was assembled to review the footage and identify victims, working in shifts to minimize psychological trauma. The tapes revealed that Travis had been far more prolific than investigators had initially suspected. While only 12 victims could be definitively identified from the recordings, there were references to others who may have been killed before Travis began documenting his crimes. The letter to the Post-Dispatch had claimed knowledge of many others, suggesting that the true victim count might never be known. As news of the arrest spread through St. Louis, the community struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the crimes. The fact that Travis had been operating undetected for years in a suburban neighborhood raised uncomfortable questions about law enforcement priorities and society's treatment of the victims. Family members of the identified victims expressed a mixture of relief and anguish at finally learning the truth about their loved ones' fates. Betty James's daughter, Michelle, told reporters, "At least now we know what happened to her. It doesn't make the pain go away, but at least we know." The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the graphic nature of the evidence. Travis was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. However, before the case could go to trial, Travis made a decision that would deny the victims' families their day in court. On June 10, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest, Maury Travis was found dead in his jail cell at the St. Louis County Justice Center. He had hanged himself using a sheet, leaving behind no note or explanation. The suicide came as a shock to investigators who had been preparing what they believed would be one of the most significant serial killer prosecutions in Missouri history. Dr. Michael Graham, the St. Louis County medical examiner who performed the autopsy, ruled the death a suicide. Security footage from the jail showed that Travis had been alone in his cell for approximately 40 minutes before his body was discovered during a routine check. The timing of the suicide raised questions about whether Travis had been adequately monitored, given the severity of the charges against him. Jail officials defended their procedures, noting that Travis had not been placed on suicide watch because he had shown no signs of self-harm during his initial psychological evaluation. With Travis's death, many questions about his crimes would remain forever unanswered. Investigators had hoped to learn more about additional victims and the full extent of his activities. The geographical range of the body dump sites suggested that Travis might have been operating in multiple states, but without his cooperation, these leads could not be pursued. The house at 1001 Ford Drive was eventually demolished, but not before becoming a macabre tourist attraction that drew curiosity seekers from across the region. The Ferguson Police Department was forced to station officers at the property to prevent trespassing and vandalism. The case had far-reaching implications for law enforcement practices, particularly in the area of cybercrime investigation. The successful tracing of the MapQuest data represented one of the first major victories for digital forensics and demonstrated the potential for internet activity to leave traceable evidence. The Travis case also highlighted systemic failures in the investigation of crimes against marginalized populations. Several of his victims had been reported missing months or even years before their bodies were discovered. Yet their cases had received minimal attention from police. The revelation that a serial killer had been operating undetected while targeting prostitutes and drug addicts sparked calls for reform in how such cases are prioritized. Dr. Eric Hickey, a criminologist who studied the case extensively, noted that Travis represented a new category of serial killer, one who combined traditional sadistic impulses with modern technology to create an unprecedented level of documentation and control. He wasn't just killing these women, Hickey observed. He was creating a permanent archive of their suffering, something he could access and experience repeatedly. The psychological analysis of Travis's behavior revealed several disturbing trends that would influence future serial killer investigations. His use of video technology, his systematic approach to victim selection, and his apparent desire to create a permanent record of his crimes suggested a level of premeditation and organization that exceeded that of most serial killers. The impact on the victims' families was profound and lasting. Many had spent years not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, holding on to hope that they might still be alive. The discovery of the videotapes provided definitive answers, but at a terrible psychological cost. In the years following Travis's death, several of the families filed wrongful death lawsuits against various entities, alleging that their loved ones' disappearances had not been adequately investigated. While most of these suits were ultimately unsuccessful, they served to keep the case in the public eye and highlighted ongoing concerns about how law enforcement responds to crimes against vulnerable populations. The basement at 1001 Ford Drive had been more than just a crime scene. It had been a factory of suffering, a place where human beings were reduced to objects for one man's twisted gratification. The videos Travis created there would haunt everyone who saw them, serving as a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity. Today, the lot where the house once stood remains empty, a small patch of grass in a suburban neighborhood that continues to carry the weight of its horrific history. The case of Maury Travis serves as a chilling reminder that evil can flourish in the most ordinary of places, hidden behind the facade of suburban respectability, until technology, the very tool used to document the crimes, ultimately exposes the truth. The women who died in that basement were more than just victims of a serial killer. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, human beings whose lives had value far beyond the circumstances that led them to cross paths with Maury Travis. Their stories, preserved in the most horrific way imaginable, stand as testament to the importance of seeing past society's prejudices to recognize the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstances. In the end, the legacy of the Travis case extends far beyond the crimes themselves, serving as a watershed moment in both digital forensics and our understanding of how technology can be both a tool of evil and the key to its detection. The Black Widow of LaPorte. The morning fog rolled across the Indiana countryside like a shroud, settling into the hollows and creases of LaPorte County's farmland with the kind of persistence that seemed to whisper of secrets buried deep. On April 28, 1908, that fog would lift to reveal horrors that would transform a Norwegian immigrant's homestead into America's most notorious murder farm, and Belle Gunness into a name that would haunt the collective memory of a nation still finding its footing in the new century. But the story of Belle Gunness, born Brynhild Polsdatter Størset in the fishing village of Selbu, Norway, on November 11, 1859, began not with the stench of burning flesh and charred bones that would eventually define her legacy, but with the seemingly innocent dreams of a young woman seeking prosperity in the promised land of America. Like thousands of her Norwegian compatriots, Belle arrived at Ellis Island in 1881, carrying nothing but determination and a cunning intelligence that would prove far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The transformation from Brynhild to Belle was more than merely linguistic adaptation. It represented a calculated reinvention that would become her signature throughout a life built on deception, manipulation, and methodical murder. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and strong hands of someone accustomed to hard labor, Belle possessed a physical presence that commanded attention. Her pale blue eyes, which neighbors would later describe as capable of shifting from maternal warmth to cold calculation in an instant, surveyed her new American landscape with the calculating gaze of a predator identifying hunting grounds. Chicago in the 1880s provided the perfect environment for someone of Belle's particular talents. The rapidly expanding city, swollen with immigrants and fortunes both made and lost daily, offered anonymity and opportunity in equal measure. Belle's first marriage to Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen in 1884 appeared to follow the conventional pattern of immigrant assimilation, a hard-working Norwegian couple establishing themselves in a new country. Sorensen, a store owner with modest but steady income, represented stability and respectability. What he couldn't have known was that he had married a woman who viewed marriage not as a partnership, but as a business transaction with potentially fatal consequences. The Sorensen household experienced an unusual number of tragic accidents and mysterious illnesses. Their first home suffered a convenient fire that resulted in a substantial insurance payout. When they purchased a candy store together, it too fell victim to flames that seemed to have an uncanny ability to maximize insurance benefits while minimizing actual loss to Belle personally. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid suspicion from authorities, but consistent enough to suggest careful planning rather than coincidental misfortune. The birth of their children, Myrtle, Axel, and Caroline, might have suggested domestic contentment, but those who knew Belle well began to notice disturbing patterns in her behavior. Neighbors observed that she displayed little maternal affection, treating her children more like accessories to her carefully constructed image than beloved offspring. More troubling were the frequent illnesses that plagued the Sorensen household, illnesses that seemed to strike with suspicious timing and severity. On July 30th, 1900, the most significant accident of Belle's Chicago period occurred when Mads Sorensen died suddenly on the one day when both of his life insurance policies overlapped, ensuring maximum payout to his grieving widow. The symptoms Sorensen exhibited before his death, violent stomach pains, convulsions, and the distinctive cherry-red coloration associated with certain poisonings, were noted by the attending physician, but not investigated further. Belle's performance as the devastated widow was convincing enough to satisfy authorities, and she walked away with nearly $8,500 in insurance money, a fortune that would fund the next phase of her deadly career. The death of infant Axel shortly after his father's demise raised eyebrows among neighbors, but not suspicions among authorities. Belle explained the tragedy as a result of acute colitis, and the grieving mother act she had perfected served her well once again. With Mads dead, Axel buried, and insurance money in hand, Belle was free to pursue her next opportunity. That opportunity presented itself in the form of Peter Gunnes, a Norwegian widower with 2 daughters, who owned a prosperous farm in LaPorte, Indiana. LaPorte, a small city approximately 60 miles east of Chicago, represented the perfect hunting ground for Belle's evolving methodology. Small enough that she could establish herself as a respected member of the community, yet large enough to provide a steady stream of potential victims, LaPorte would become the epicenter of what investigators would later recognize as one of America's first serial killing sprees, motivated by financial gain. Belle's courtship of Peter Gunnes followed a carefully orchestrated pattern that she would refine and repeat with deadly efficiency throughout her LaPorte years. She presented herself as a hard-working widow, seeking security for herself and her remaining children, while Peter represented himself as a lonely man in need of companionship and help managing his property. Their marriage, in April 1902, seemed to promise mutual benefit and domestic happiness. The reality proved far different. Within a week of the wedding, tragedy struck the Gunnes household when Peter's infant daughter from his previous marriage died, under circumstances that Belle attributed to natural causes. The speed with which the child succumbed to illness, combined with Belle's matter-of-fact reaction to the loss, suggested a chilling pragmatism in her approach to eliminating obstacles to her plans. Peter Gunnes himself survived only 8 months of marriage to Belle. On December 16, 1902, he died from what Belle claimed was an accident involving a meat grinder that had fallen from a high shelf, striking him in the head with fatal force. The implausibility of a meat grinder maintaining enough momentum after falling to cause fatal head trauma raised questions among neighbors, but Belle's grief seemed genuine enough to forestall official investigation. Once again, insurance money flowed into Belle's accounts, and she found herself in sole possession of the Gunnes farm. The death of Peter Gunnes marked a turning point in Belle's criminal evolution. No longer content with the relatively modest payouts from insurance fraud and opportunistic murders within her immediate family, she began to recognize the profit potential in expanding her operations. The farm, with its isolated location and substantial outbuildings, provided the perfect infrastructure for a more ambitious enterprise. Belle's methodology became increasingly sophisticated as she recognized that the steady stream of lonely men seeking companionship represented an untapped resource. Through carefully placed advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers throughout the Midwest, she began attracting suitors to her LaPorte property with promises of marriage, companionship, and shared prosperity. Her advertisements painted a picture of domestic bliss and financial security that proved irresistible to bachelor farmers, widowers, and immigrants seeking to establish themselves in America. The typical pattern of Belle's operations during her LaPorte years followed a consistent framework that demonstrated both psychological manipulation and methodical planning. Potential suitors would receive warm, encouraging letters that gradually escalated in intimacy and financial discussion. Belle would express her desire to merge their properties and resources, suggesting that a substantial cash investment would allow them to expand the farm operations and secure their mutual future. The amount requested was carefully calculated, large enough to represent significant wealth transfer, but not so large as to be impossible for her typical victim demographic. John Moe, a Norwegian immigrant from Minnesota, became one of Belle's first documented LaPorte victims when he arrived at the farm in December 1906, carrying nearly $1,000 in cash as requested. Neighbors reported seeing Moe working around the property for several days before he vanished entirely. When concerned friends and family members inquired about his whereabouts, Belle claimed he had decided farming wasn't suitable for him and had departed for parts unknown. The pattern was established: arrival, brief visibility in the community, sudden disappearance, and Belle's explanation of the victim's voluntary departure. The disappearances began to accumulate with disturbing frequency. Ole Budsberg arrived from Wisconsin in 1907 with his life savings, only to vanish after a few weeks of courtship. Andrew Hageline made the journey from South Dakota with dreams of marriage and partnership, carrying cash that represented years of careful saving. Thomas Linbow travelled from Chicago based on Belle's promises of domestic happiness and shared prosperity. Each man arrived with hope and departed only in Belle's carefully crafted explanations to anyone who inquired about their whereabouts. Belle's psychological manipulation techniques were as refined as her methods of murder and disposal. She understood instinctively how to appeal to the deepest desires and insecurities of lonely men seeking companionship and security. Her letters combined maternal nurturing with romantic promise, financial opportunity with emotional intimacy. She presented herself as a hard-working woman who had been unfortunate in love, but remained optimistic about finding true partnership. The combination proved irresistible to men who had often struggled with isolation and economic uncertainty in their adopted country. The physical process of murder appears to have varied depending on circumstances and opportunity. Some victims were likely poisoned, following Belle's established pattern from her Chicago years. Others may have been struck down with the kind of accidents that had befallen her husbands. The isolated nature of the farm meant that Belle could take her time, plan carefully, and dispose of evidence without fear of immediate discovery. The disposal of bodies represented perhaps the most chilling aspect of Belle's operations. The farm's butcher shop, originally constructed for processing livestock, provided the perfect facility for dismembering human remains. Belle's experience in food preparation and preservation, skills that had served her well as a farm wife, now became tools for concealing evidence of mass murder. Body parts were systematically processed, with some remains buried in carefully selected locations around the property, and others disposed of through methods that remain unclear to this day. The financial returns from Belle's LaPorte operations were substantial. Conservative estimates suggest she accumulated tens of thousands of dollars through her systematic murder of suitors, an enormous fortune for the time period. This wealth allowed her to maintain the farm in excellent condition, present herself as a prosperous and desirable catch for future victims, and invest in the infrastructure necessary to continue her operations on an increasingly large scale. As Belle's confidence grew, so did her ambition. She began targeting wealthier victims, men whose disappearances might attract more attention, but whose financial resources justified the increased risk. The careful balance between profit maximization and risk management that characterized her operations demonstrated a criminal intelligence that was both sophisticated and terrifying in its cold calculation. The beginning of Belle's downfall can be traced to her relationship with Ray Lamphere, a farmhand she employed during her most active period of killing. Lamphere, a local man with limited education but considerable physical strength, became both an asset and a liability in Belle's operations, while his knowledge of the farm's layout and his willingness to follow orders without asking questions made him valuable for the physical demands of murder and disposal. His growing emotional attachment to Belle created complications she had not anticipated. Lamphere's transformation from useful employee to dangerous liability occurred gradually as he began to understand the true nature of Belle's activities. Whether through direct observation, accidental discovery, or gradual realization, Lamphere became aware that the stream of men arriving at the farm were not departing as Belle claimed. His emotional investment in Belle made him simultaneously protective of her secrets and resentful of her treatment of him as merely another tool in her operations. The tension between Belle and Lamphere escalated throughout 1907 and early 1908 as his demands for greater intimacy and recognition conflicted with her need to maintain operational security. Lamphere's increasing jealousy of Belle's suitors, combined with his knowledge of their ultimate fate, created a volatile situation that threatened the careful balance Belle had maintained throughout her criminal career. The arrival of Andrew Hageline's brother Assel in January 1908, searching for information about his missing sibling, marked the beginning of external pressure that Bell had previously managed to avoid. Arsène Hagelin's persistence in seeking answers about his brother's disappearance, combined with his willingness to involve local authorities, represented a new type of threat to Bell's operations. Unlike the isolated men who had disappeared without anyone to advocate for them, Andrew Hagelin had family members who refused to accept Bell's explanations. Bell's response to this pressure demonstrated both her continued cunning and the first signs that her carefully constructed system was becoming unsustainable. She began making preparations for what appears to have been a planned disappearance, including attempts to secure additional insurance coverage and arrangements for the care of her remaining children. The methodical nature of these preparations suggests that Bell recognized her Laporte operations had reached their natural conclusion and that she needed to engineer her own extraction from the situation. The climactic events of April 27th to 28th, 1908 began with a fire that consumed the Gunness farmhouse in the early morning hours. Neighbours responding to the blaze discovered what appeared to be the bodies of Bell and her 3 children in the basement, apparently victims of smoke inhalation who had been unable to escape the flames. The discovery of these bodies, combined with Ray Lamphere's arrest for arson and murder, seemed to provide a neat conclusion to what had been a growing investigation into the disappearances at the Gunness farm. However, the physical evidence discovered in the fire's aftermath raised immediate questions about the official narrative. The body presumed to be Bell's was significantly smaller than witnesses remembered, lacking the distinctive physical characteristics that had made her so memorable to community members. More troubling was the absence of a head on the adult female corpse, a detail that suggested deliberate mutilation rather than fire damage. Sheriff Albert Smutzer's investigation of the burned farmhouse quickly expanded beyond the immediate crime scene as the scope of Bell's activities became apparent. The systematic search of the property revealed a charnel house that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. In the pig pen behind the house, investigators discovered dismembered human remains that represented multiple victims. The professional manner in which the bodies had been processed suggested someone with considerable experience in butchering and meat preparation. The excavation of the Gunness property continued for weeks as investigators uncovered additional remains scattered throughout the grounds. Each discovery added to the growing realization that Bell Gunness had operated what amounted to a murder factory, systematically killing visitors to her farm over a period of several years. The final victim count remained uncertain, with estimates ranging from 14 confirmed deaths to potentially 40 or more individuals who may have fallen prey to Bell's operations. The forensic evidence recovered from the Gunness farm painted a detailed picture of Bell's methodology and the scale of her crimes. Personal effects recovered from burial sites matched descriptions of missing persons from across the Midwest, confirming that Bell's victims had traveled from multiple states based on her carefully crafted correspondence. The discovery of watches, jewelry, and other valuable items suggested that robbery had been a consistent motive, while the systematic nature of the body disposal indicated careful planning and extensive experience. The trial of Ray Lamphere for arson and murder became a sensation that attracted national media attention and revealed the full scope of Bell's crimes to a horrified public. Testimony from investigators described the methodical excavation of human remains, while witnesses provided details about Bell's relationships with her victims and the suspicious circumstances surrounding their disappearances. Lamphere's defense team argued that he had been manipulated by Bell and had not participated in the murders themselves, while prosecutors maintained that he had been an active accomplice in both the killings and the final arson that was intended to destroy evidence. The question of Bell's fate remained unresolved throughout Lamphere's trial and continues to fascinate researchers and investigators to this day. The headless corpse discovered in the farmhouse basement was too small to be Bell, suggesting that she had staged her own death and escaped before the fire. Sightings of Bell were reported across the Midwest for decades following the Laporte fire, with some witnesses claiming to have encountered her in various communities where she was attempting to establish new identities. The psychological profile that emerges from Belle Gunness's crimes reveals a killer whose methodology combined elements of several different criminal typologies. Her systematic targeting of lonely men seeking companionship demonstrated the calculated approach of an organized serial killer, while her use of insurance fraud and financial manipulation showed the profit-driven thinking of a white-collar criminal. The domestic setting of her crimes and her use of traditional feminine roles as camouflage represented an early example of what criminologists would later recognize as the Black Widow killer archetype. Belle's success in avoiding detection for so many years resulted from her sophisticated understanding of contemporary social dynamics and law enforcement limitations. Her targeting of isolated immigrants, men whose disappearances were unlikely to trigger intensive investigation, demonstrated careful victim selection based on risk assessment. Her establishment of herself as a respectable community member provided cover for her activities, while her manipulation of traditional gender expectations allowed her to operate below the suspicion threshold that might have been applied to a male criminal engaging in similar activities. The Belle Gunness case had profound implications for American law enforcement and criminal investigation techniques. The scale of her crimes and the sophistication of her methods highlighted the need for better communication between jurisdictions and more systematic approaches to investigating missing persons cases. The forensic challenges presented by the Gunness farm excavation contributed to the development of more advanced techniques for processing complex crime scenes and identifying human remains. The cultural impact of Belle Gunness extended far beyond the immediate legal and investigative consequences of her crimes. She became a figure of popular fascination, inspiring countless books, articles, and folk songs that attempted to understand how a woman could commit such systematic and brutal murders. The contrast between her public persona as a hardworking farm wife and the reality of her crimes challenged contemporary assumptions about female criminality and domestic violence. The economic motivations behind Belle's crimes reflected broader social and economic conditions in early 20th century America that made her systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals possible. The isolation experienced by many immigrants, particularly single men seeking to establish themselves in rural communities, created a population of potential victims who lacked the social connections that might have protected them from predatory criminals. Belle's understanding of these vulnerabilities and her willingness to exploit them systematically represented a particularly calculating form of criminal entrepreneurship. The investigative challenges presented by the Gunness case highlighted the limitations of contemporary law enforcement capabilities when confronted with crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries and involved sophisticated planning over extended time periods. The lack of centralized databases for tracking missing persons, combined with limited communication between law enforcement agencies in different states, allowed Belle to operate with impunity for years while accumulating victims from across the region. The forensic evidence recovered from the Gunness farm provided unprecedented insights into the methodology of a serial killer operating in a domestic setting. The systematic nature of the body disposal, combined with the professional quality of the dismemberment, suggested that Belle had developed increasingly efficient methods for concealing her crimes as her experience grew. The location of remains in various parts of the property indicated careful planning to minimize the risk of accidental discovery while maximizing the farm's capacity for concealing evidence. The question of accomplices in Belle's crimes remains partially unresolved, though evidence suggests that Ray Lamphere had knowledge of at least some of her activities. The physical demands of moving and disposing of multiple bodies, combined with the need to maintain normal farm operations while concealing evidence of murder, suggests that Belle may have had additional assistance that was never identified by investigators. The fear and intimidation that may have prevented potential witnesses from coming forward reflects the climate of terror that Bell had created in her immediate community. The Bell Gunness case represents a watershed moment in American criminal history, marking the emergence of organized serial killing as a recognized phenomenon and highlighting the particular dangers posed by criminals who operated within seemingly respectable domestic settings. Her crimes demonstrated that the most dangerous predators might be those who appeared most normal, who integrated themselves into communities and used traditional social roles as camouflage for their activities. The legacy of Bell Gunness extends beyond her individual crimes to encompass broader questions about the nature of evil, the vulnerability of isolated individuals in rapidly changing societies, and the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies confronting unprecedented forms of criminal behavior. Her story serves as a reminder that the capacity for systematic violence and exploitation exists within seemingly ordinary communities, and that the protection of vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance and sophisticated investigative capabilities. As morning fog continues to roll across the Indiana countryside, more than a century after Bell Gunness's crimes shocked the nation, the lessons of her case remain relevant to contemporary efforts to understand and prevent serial violence. The systematic nature of her crimes, the sophistication of her planning, and the psychological manipulation she employed to control her victims represent early examples of criminal patterns that continue to challenge law enforcement and mental health professionals today. In the careful excavation of her victims' remains and the painstaking reconstruction of her methods, investigators not only solved a series of horrific crimes, but also contributed to the development of modern criminal investigation techniques that continue to serve justice in cases of organized violence and systematic predation. The Chessboard Killer. The morning of September 15th, 2007, arrived grey and cold in Moscow's Bitsevsky Park, the kind of autumn day that seems to leach colour from the world itself. Detective Pavel Fyodorov stood at the edge of a shallow grave, watching forensic specialists carefully extract human remains from the damp earth. This was the 48th body they had recovered from the sprawling parkland that bordered the city's southern suburbs, each discovery adding another piece to a puzzle that had consumed the Moscow police for over a decade. What they didn't yet know was that they were excavating the physical manifestation of one man's obsession with death. A grotesque game board where human lives served as pawns in the twisted imagination of Alexander Yuryevich Pichushkin, a man who would later boast that killing had become as natural to him as breathing. The story begins not with murder, but with a moment of childhood innocence forever shattered. On a sweltering summer day in 1992, 4-year-old Alexander Pichushkin was playing on a swing set in the courtyard of his apartment building in Moscow's Mytishchi district. The swing set, a Soviet-era construction of rusted metal and weathered wood, stood precariously on uneven ground. As young Alexander pumped his legs to gain height, the chain snapped, sending him tumbling backward onto the concrete below. The impact was devastating. Alexander's skull struck the pavement with a sickening crack that echoed through the courtyard, drawing screams from his mother, Natalia Pichushkina, who rushed from their 5th-floor apartment to find her son unconscious in a spreading pool of blood. The ambulance ride to Burdenko Neurosurgical Institute became a blur of sirens and frantic medical intervention. For 3 days, Alexander lay in a coma while doctors worked to relieve the pressure on his swelling brain. Dr. Mikhail Volkov, the neurosurgeon who operated on the boy, would later testify that the frontal lobe damage was severe, but not uncommon for such injuries. What was uncommon, he noted in his medical records, was the marked change in the child's personality following the accident. Before the fall, Alexander had been described by his mother as quiet but affectionate, a boy who enjoyed puzzles and showed remarkable patience for complex problems. After his recovery, those who knew him noticed a disturbing transformation. He became cold, his mother would later tell investigators. Not just quiet, cold, like something inside him had broken that the doctors couldn't fix. The Pichushkin family lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment that epitomized the declining fortunes of post-Soviet Russia. Alexander's father, Yuri Pichushkin, had been a factory foreman during the communist era, but the economic collapse of the early 1990s had left him unemployed and increasingly dependent on vodka to numb his frustration. His mother worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner, leaving Alexander largely unsupervised during his formative years. It was during this period of neglect and domestic chaos that Alexander discovered chess. His grandfather, Sergei Pichushkin, a retired mathematics professor, introduced the boy to the game when Alexander was 7 years old. What began as an attempt to provide structure and intellectual stimulation quickly revealed something unsettling about the child's mind. Alexander didn't just learn chess, his grandfather would later recall during police interviews. He devoured it. He would sit for hours studying positions, but what disturbed me was how he talked about the pieces. To him, they weren't just game pieces. They were living things that he controlled completely. By age 10, Alexander was regularly defeating adult players at the local chess club in Izmailovo Park. His style was described by opponents as ruthlessly methodical, showing no mercy even when facing clearly overmatched opponents. Club president Viktor Petrov noted in his journal that young Pichushkin seemed to derive unusual pleasure from the moment of checkmate, often staring intently at his defeated opponents as if studying their reactions to loss. The first signs of violence emerged during Alexander's early teenage years. In 1995, when he was 13, several neighborhood cats were found dead in the courtyard of his apartment building, their skulls crushed with what police reports described as deliberate, methodical force. No one connected these deaths to the quiet boy from apartment 52, but years later, Alexander would admit to investigators that he had used a hammer stolen from a construction site to kill the animals. "I wanted to see what it felt like," he told Detective Fyodorov during his confession. "The cats were just practice. I was already thinking about people." Alexander's academic performance remained average throughout his schooling, but teachers consistently noted his unusual fascination with death and violence in his essays and classroom discussions. His history teacher, Maria Volkova, preserved several of his written assignments that revealed a disturbing preoccupation with historical mass murderers and war criminals. In one essay about World War II, 13-year-old Alexander wrote extensively about the efficiency of Nazi execution methods, displaying knowledge that went far beyond typical teenage interests. The transformation from disturbed adolescent to killer accelerated after Alexander's graduation from secondary school in 1997. Unable to gain admission to university and lacking the connections necessary for stable employment in post-Soviet Russia, he found work as a street sweeper and later as a grocery store clerk. These menial jobs, combined with his social isolation and growing resentment toward society, created a dangerous psychological pressure that would soon find its outlet in murder. It was during this period that Alexander began spending increasing amounts of time in Moscow's parks, particularly Bitsevsky Park, a sprawling wilderness area that had become a refuge for the city's homeless population, alcoholics, and social outcasts. The park's vast network of walking trails, dense forests, and secluded clearings provided the perfect hunting ground for what Alexander was planning. The first murder occurred on a frigid evening in February 1992, though this initial killing would remain unknown to authorities for years. Alexander, then 19, encountered a homeless man named Mikhail Odichuk near a park bench where Odichuk regularly slept. According to Alexander's later confession, He approached the man under the pretense of offering vodka, then struck him repeatedly in the head with a hammer he had concealed in his jacket. "I felt nothing," Alexander told investigators. "No excitement, no fear, no regret. It was like completing a chess move, just the logical next step in the game." Alexander dragged Odichuk's body into the woods and buried it in a shallow grave, covering the site with fallen branches and leaves. The homeless man's disappearance went unnoticed by authorities, his absence unremarkable in a society where people frequently vanished into the chaos of economic transition. What followed was a 14-year killing spree that would terrorize Moscow and establish Alexander Pichushkin as one of Russia's most prolific serial killers. His method remained consistent. He would approach victims in parks or other public spaces, often offering alcohol as a means of gaining their trust, then lead them to secluded areas where he would strike them with a hammer before burying their bodies in remote locations. The psychological profile that emerged during his later prosecution revealed a killer driven not by sexual violence or financial gain, but by an almost abstract desire for control and completion. Dr. Yelena Safonova, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Alexander extensively, noted that he viewed his murders as moves in an elaborate chess game, with each victim representing a square on a board that he was systematically filling. Alexander's own explanation was even more chilling in its simplicity. "I wanted to kill enough people to fill all 64 squares of a chessboard. It was the only way to make the game complete." This chess obsession wasn't merely metaphorical. When police eventually searched Alexander's apartment, they discovered a chessboard where he had marked each of his murders with dates and victim initials. 49 squares were filled when he was arrested, leaving him 15 victims short of his macabre goal. The victims themselves represented a cross-section of Moscow's most vulnerable populations. Many were homeless individuals or chronic alcoholics who frequented the city's parks. Others were elderly pensioners taking solitary walks, or mentally ill individuals who had been drawn into conversation by Alexander's deceptively friendly demeanor. The common thread was their isolation. People whose disappearances were unlikely to trigger immediate police investigations. Among the victims was Maria Viricheva, a 63-year-old retired librarian who had been feeding stray cats in Bitsevsky Park when she encountered Alexander in June 2001. Her body was discovered 3 years later, her skull bearing the characteristic crushing injuries that had become Alexander's signature. Her daughter, Svetlana Viricheva, spent months searching for her mother before police confirmed her death. "She was just trying to help the animals," Svetlana said during Alexander's trial. "She had such a kind heart. She couldn't have imagined that someone would hurt her just for the pleasure of killing." Another victim, 60-year-old Pavel Fedotov, had been a veteran of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Struggling with alcoholism and post-traumatic stress, Fedotov had become one of the regular inhabitants of Moscow's park system. Alexander approached him in September 2003, offering to share a bottle of vodka. Fedotov's military training might have saved him under other circumstances, but Alexander's method of attack, a sudden overwhelming assault with a blunt instrument, gave victims no opportunity to defend themselves. The investigation into what would become known as the Bitsevsky Park murders began in earnest in 2001, when the discovery of multiple bodies in the park forced Moscow police to acknowledge they were dealing with a serial killer. Detective Captain Pavel Fyodorov was assigned to lead the investigation, inheriting what had become one of the most complex criminal cases in modern Russian history. Fyodorov, a 20-year veteran of the Moscow police force, immediately recognized the challenges he faced. The victims' profiles, homeless individuals, alcoholics, and social outcasts, meant that many disappearances had gone unreported for months or even years. The killer's careful burial of bodies in remote forest locations had prevented the discovery of a clear crime pattern until the body count had already reached double digits. "We were fighting two enemies," Fyodorov later explained. The killer himself, and the indifference of a society that didn't notice when its most vulnerable members disappeared. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a methodical, organized killer. Dr. Anna Kovalenko, the chief medical examiner assigned to the case, noted the consistency of the injuries across all victims. Each had suffered multiple blunt force trauma wounds to the skull, delivered with what appeared to be the same weapon, a hammer or similar tool. The precision of the strikes suggested someone with significant upper body strength who was comfortable with violence. More disturbing was the evidence of the killer's behavior after the murders. Several bodies showed signs of having been positioned carefully after death, with personal items arranged around them in specific patterns. Crime scene photographer Boris Malinovsky documented these arrangements, noting what appeared to be a ritualistic element to the killer's post-mortem behavior. The breakthrough in the case came not through forensic science or detective work, but through Alexander's own growing carelessness and desire for recognition. By 2005, he had begun taking photographs of his crime scenes with a digital camera, creating what he called his collection. These photographs, discovered later on his computer, provided investigators with precise documentation of his methods and locations. More significantly, Alexander had begun to crave attention for his crimes. He started leaving subtle clues at crime scenes and even began writing anonymous letters to Moscow newspapers, hinting at his activities without providing enough detail for police to identify him. This psychological need for recognition would ultimately lead to his downfall. The final act of Alexander's killing spree began on June 14, 2006, when he encountered Marina Moskalyova in Bitsevsky Park. Marina, a 36-year-old single mother, had been walking her dog when Alexander approached her with his typical friendly demeanor. What Alexander didn't know was that Marina had told her boyfriend, Pavel Shcherbakov, exactly where she was going and when she expected to return. When Marina failed to come home that evening, Pavel immediately contacted police and insisted on organizing a search party. His persistence, unusual in a society where missing person reports were often dismissed, led to the rapid discovery of Marina's body and the crime scene evidence that would finally connect Alexander to the murders. The arrest came on June 16, 2006, when Alexander returned to Bitsevsky Park, apparently to visit the scene of his latest crime. Detective Fyodorov had stationed surveillance teams throughout the park, and Alexander's suspicious behavior, particularly his detailed knowledge of the area where Marina's body had been found, immediately drew their attention. When confronted, Alexander initially denied involvement, but the discovery of Marina's blood on his clothing and shoes quickly broke down his resistance. What followed was one of the most comprehensive criminal confessions in Russian legal history, as Alexander detailed not only Marina's murder, but 48 additional killings spanning 14 years. "I am sorry that I stopped," Alexander told investigators during one interview session. "If I had continued, I could have killed many more." The trial of Alexander Pichushkin began on September 13, 2007, in Moscow City Court, drawing international media attention and horrifying the Russian public with its detailed revelations about the scope and nature of the crimes. Presiding Judge Vladimir Usov faced the challenging task of managing a proceeding that involved 49 murder charges and hundreds of pieces of evidence. The prosecution, led by senior prosecutor Mikhail Alexandrov, presented a case that painted Alexander as a cold, calculating killer, driven by an insatiable need for control and recognition. The evidence included the chessboard found in his apartment, hundreds of crime scene photographs, forensic analysis of the victim's remains, and Alexander's own detailed confessions. The defendant treated human beings like chess pieces, prosecutor Alexandrov told the court. He moved them around his board until they were no longer useful to him, then eliminated them with the same cold calculation that a player might sacrifice a pawn. The defense, led by attorney Sergei Marchere, attempted to argue that Alexander's childhood brain injury had left him mentally incompetent and unable to control his actions. They presented medical evidence about frontal lobe damage and its potential effects on personality and impulse control, arguing that Alexander was more victim than perpetrator. This defense strategy was undermined by Alexander himself, who showed clear signs of enjoying the attention his trial brought him. He frequently smiled during testimony about his crimes, corrected prosecutors on details of specific murders, and even expressed disappointment that he had been caught before completing his goal of 64 killings. Dr. Safanova's psychiatric evaluation, presented during the trial, concluded that while Alexander showed clear signs of antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, he was fully competent to stand trial and understood the nature of his crimes. Her testimony effectively demolished the defense's argument about diminished capacity. The victim impact statements provided some of the trial's most emotional moments. Family members who had searched for years for missing relatives finally learned the truth about their loved ones' fates. Svetlana Viricheva's testimony about her mother Maria was particularly powerful as she described the elderly woman's kindness and the devastating impact of her disappearance on the family. "He didn't just kill her," Svetlana told the court. "He erased her from the world as if she had never existed. That's what made the waiting so horrible, not knowing if she was suffering somewhere or if she was already gone." On October 29th, 2007, Judge Usov delivered the verdict. Guilty on all 49 counts of murder. Alexander showed no emotion as the judge read through each victim's name and the details of their deaths. The sentence was life imprisonment, to be served in a maximum security facility in the Russian Arctic. Alexander's final statement to the court revealed the depth of his psychological pathology. "I am not sorry for what I did. The only thing I regret is that I was caught before I could finish the game." The chessboard killer case forced Russian society to confront uncomfortable truths about its treatment of vulnerable populations and the gaps in its social safety net that had allowed Alexander to hunt virtually undetected for 14 years. The fact that so many victims were homeless individuals or chronic alcoholics, whose disappearances went uninvestigated, highlighted systemic problems that extended far beyond criminal justice. Detective Fyodorov, reflecting on the case years later, noted that Alexander's success as a serial killer was enabled not just by his cunning, but by a society that had essentially written off his victims as expendable. "He chose people he knew wouldn't be missed," Fyodorov observed. "That says something terrible about us as a society." The investigation also revealed significant shortcomings in police coordination and information sharing. Bodies had been discovered in Bitsevsky Park over a span of several years, but different police districts had handled individual cases without recognizing the pattern. The lack of a centralized database for tracking similar crimes had allowed Alexander to operate undetected far longer than should have been possible. Alexander Pichushkin remains incarcerated at Black Dolphin Prison in Soliletsk, a facility designed for Russia's most dangerous criminals. Prison officials report that he continues to play chess obsessively, often spending entire days studying chess problems and theory. He has requested books on famous chess masters and historical games, maintaining his lifelong obsession with the game that provided the framework for his murders. In rare interviews with journalists, Alexander has expressed no remorse for his crimes and continues to view them through the lens of his chess metaphor. "Every game must have an ending," he told one reporter in 2015. "Mine ended prematurely, but the moves I made were all correct, according to my strategy." The psychological literature that has emerged from the Pichushkin case has contributed significantly to understanding of organized serial killers and the role of childhood brain trauma in the development of violent behavior. Dr. Safanova's research, based on her extensive interviews with Alexander, has been published in international forensic psychiatry journals and continues to inform criminal profiling techniques. The case also highlighted the importance of community awareness and rapid response to missing person reports. Marina Moskalyova's murder was solved quickly precisely because her boyfriend refused to accept police dismissal of her disappearance, demonstrating how citizen advocacy can be crucial in protecting vulnerable populations. Bitsevsky Park itself has been transformed in the aftermath of the murders. The Moscow city government installed better lighting throughout the park system, increased police patrols, and created social services outreach programs targeting the homeless population that had been Alexander's primary hunting ground. Memorial plaques have been placed at various locations throughout the park, bearing the names of victims and serving as reminders of the lives lost to one man's twisted obsession. The chessboard that police discovered in Alexander's apartment remains in evidence storage at Moscow Police Headquarters, a grim artifact of one of Russia's most notorious criminal cases. The 49 marked squares serve as a physical manifestation of the killer's methodical approach to murder, each mark representing a human life reduced to a game piece in Alexander Pichushkin's macabre competition with himself. For the families of victims, the trial's conclusion brought some measure of closure, but the pain of loss remains. Many have formed support groups and advocate for better protection of vulnerable populations, working to ensure that the societal indifference that enabled Alexander's crimes never again allows such wholesale slaughter to continue undetected. The story of Alexander Pichushkin stands as a stark reminder that the capacity for evil exists alongside the most ordinary of circumstances. His transformation from a brain-injured child to one of history's most prolific serial killers illustrates how untreated psychological damage, combined with social isolation and societal neglect, can create monsters who view human life as nothing more than pieces to be moved around their personal game board until the final, inevitable checkmate.